has much to do with safeguarding, but...
Listen, the Druids did a lot of human sacrifice, according to the Romans. Probably not, but the Romans said did it. So in a sense, that's safeguarding as a link, isn't it?
Okay, we'll take it. We'll take it. No, today we are going to be focusing on the theme of safeguarding, and it's quite a big concept actually, but it's just so relevant now, right? Like, I think most people in education were like, yeah, okay, if it's in person, I understand what's going on. I got policies, I got processes, I'm on it. But now everyone's online. They're like, whoa, a lot of those things, do they apply? Don't they apply? What am I not thinking about? And I felt that this was quite a relevant topic. And one that I think you'll maybe together, we can kind of patch together something easy for people to kind of take away and at least start part of their investigation. One thing I do want to make clear is we are not experts in safeguarding. So by no means feel that this is exhaustive or only best practice. These are just key ideas that I think are helpful.
Nigel Heritage is the expert on safeguarding, and that will always be true for the next 4 generations. But I think, what I really liked you said earlier, Alex, you put in a really interesting acronym, which I thought was a good starting point.
Cool.
About protect, which I liked.
Yes.
If you want to take her through that.
So I came up with an acronym that I think we should definitely look at and see if we can come up with something a bit more catchy and a bit more fun. But at the moment it is between PREPIR or PrEP with an IR at the end. So I think we could kind of use that at least as a structure for today. And if you, Tom, anyone else comes up with a better acronym, maybe something more pirate-like for you, Rob, add some R's in there. Then I think we could look at that too. But for now, let's just go through it and let's use this as a basic discussion. The first one out of that P was protect, right? But protecting, actually, it wasn't about protecting. It was about protecting people, the person side of things. And just looking through, and again, these are not my own ideas. These are ideas that obviously a lot of people smarter than me and a lot more, a lot more well-researched than me have kind of come up with. But certainly this idea of protecting people from, and from what I can see, some key ideas is like abuse, from harm, from neglect, from discrimination. And there may be other things that we need to protect the actual person from. And remember, today we're talking about online. Like, I feel like the in-person stuff has been done to death, and I think a lot of people feel really comfortable with that. But I think a lot of those key ideas probably translate very well online, in the fact that we are absolutely needing to protect the person. And that person is generally the student, but it also, I would say, arguably also is the teacher. And as
Definitely, I think that's really important. Yeah. And particularly now, where we've got a lot of people who, by virtue of the situation that we're all in, are isolated, and that's staff and that's students. And I think that protection is really important, isn't it? And the checking in factors and the having real conversations with people outside of a work context is really important. And particularly where we've got students who are, and we've all heard all these stories of students who have been stuck in various countries in the last few months, all stuck in their own country, expecting to come abroad and excited and really wanting that to happen, and it's a huge life event, and then suddenly not doing that. And you're still at your mum and dad's living in your spare room. Or members of staff who have, through no fault of their own, suddenly ended up back at their mum and dad's living in their spare room and think, oh no. And I think those are really important angles. And it's interesting as well with protection, because we often talk about minors and junior students, and that's great. And yet actually adult students are often, we don't think they need protection because they're adults, and yet they're often abroad and isolated, through doing their course, or they are maybe in situations that we don't know or understand. So that protection, I think, is very extensive for a school.
Yeah, I was interested in your view on this, Tom. And again, remembering this is just ideas. We don't have nearly the same experience that other companies that maybe are dealing with this on a day-to-day point of view will have. But we've been able to talk to a lot of our customers who are online and teaching online, so we do have some relevant experience. But in person, and actually part of one of the key elements we'll talk about later is the environment. But with that, you don't have a lot of control over the environment, like you do of the virtual space, perhaps. But because you're not there with them, protecting that person from, as I say, abuse, neglect, discrimination, and even breaches of trust. Online, it's a slightly different story. So what's your view on how teachers kind of play, what's their kind of responsibility in protecting, and what are some examples of abuse that maybe people aren't quite aware of in their kind of common form?
I think weird stories that I've heard that really surprise me, and then you think, well, no, of course, are the things where people are choosing to, for example, initiate contact with students or with staff that isn't welcome or isn't appropriate, because they're on camera, because they're online, but they're not actually in the same room. So there's a kind of liberation there where people think, well, what are you going to do? You know, turn off your camera. And you know, so there have been incidents where colleagues have had students suddenly you know, initiate conversations that they wouldn't do face to face, which are very inappropriate, but also action, you know, and that's been, you know, embarrassing on one level and fairly easy to shut down. But then how do you kind of pick that up, and how do you discipline that student and say, look, actually, it's not all right to, in one instance, play Thom Jones, You Can Leave Your Hat On and do a dance, because, you know, and it's funny, isn't it, because you're thinking, all right, but you know, that particular colleague was deeply embarrassed by that. And it was a student who was much older than him that initiated that, and it was a weird one because, you know, the student who initiated that, you know, had obviously had a drink and was obviously in a daft mood, and kind of just suddenly started doing that, and he was kind of mortified and unsure how to respond to that, and you know, and had to kind of close it down. But then how do you pick that up, and you know, for the next class, and go, oh, it's so high, and it's that thing, isn't it, of priests, prostitutes, and professors, where you are in either of those three professions, you are having contact with somebody for a certain amount of time, and that may be the only contact they have, you know. So there can be a very, you know, it's very easy for students to see that connection and see that contact as, you know, as a level of intimacy at which it isn't.
Ah,
you know?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good.
And they're in your home, and you're in each other's home, and you are suddenly, you know, having a cup of coffee together, sat at your kitchen table, and there isn't the normal barriers of being in the school, being in the classroom. And it's interesting because you do, you know, that thing that you know, in jobs where you are forced to talk to people, listen to people, and have often, you know, conversations that are not conversations that you would wish to have, or conversations that you don't maybe initiate in a normal way, and they don't go along normal rules. And that is that thing, you know, the priests, prostitutes, and professors, and obviously they're all very different conversations, but you're often having those conversations because it's your job. And it's easy for the respondents to those conversations, to mistake that for you're having conversations because you want to, you know.
Like, oh, this person really, you know, is really interested in what I have to say. They must be, you know, maybe that it's more than just teaching.
Of course, definitely. And you know, that happens far more than we think it does. And I think, you know, and that can be difficult for staff as well, because particularly at a time like this when people are very isolated, and it does feel, and certainly has in the last few months felt, as if, you know, all bets are off on one level. So people are thinking, well, I am enjoying this conversation, let's carry on, and be it a simple thing of saying, well, let's carry on having the conversation, and we have another hour, you know, another half hour rather than the initial hour, and that's all right, isn't it? But then, you know, when you close that down the following session, or when you're keeping it to time, then the person's often offended and upset, and you know, that professionalism is really important to keep in mind, isn't it? And I think
I like that as well. Like, I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about at LearnCube, but professionalism. And I think a big part of that is that, I mean, that's almost like, that's the go-to book, right? Like, I'm in an awkward situation, rather than, oh, what should I do? What would a professional do? Okay. Maybe kind of thinking it that way. Let's get on to the second idea. I think that we could kind of talk through for a long time, because there's so many different little interesting stories and ways of thinking about it. But the second concept, if we talked about like protecting people, is a big one. And then the second one for me is recruitment. Recruiting of tutors and teachers online. Now, tell me, Thom, since you'll be more kind of clued up, like what do teachers currently have to go through to be recruited in an in-person experience?
Sure. So most of that is the very basic stuff of people will have to prove qualifications.
Yeah.
So they've got to have, a relevant degree. They've got to have a recognised teaching diploma. And then obviously higher teaching diplomas depending on the level of responsibility they're taking. They have to do safeguarding training. So those are normally with National Heritage, as mentioned before. Yeah. There's online presentation stuff and qualifications that one can take that are similarly backed. And we also do you have to apply for a DBS certificate, which proves that you haven't got any convictions. Okay. And that's confusing because obviously in our industry, a lot of British-based teachers, for example, in the UK, will come home from teaching abroad and they get a DBS certificate in the UK saying they have no convictions because they have no convictions in the UK, but they may have loads of convictions in Thailand or Spain or wherever they've been for the last few years. So the DBS stuff is it's a nice hoop to jump, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't actually, and it's also really interesting culturally where we get adults who come and work with, for example, junior groups. So you might, if you're bringing a group of students from Sicily, you might come with your teacher or, a parent from the school or, any other adult. And what schools in the UK will generally do is, and schools in the US, is ask for a certificate or letter signed by the police locally saying the person has no convictions and is safe to work with children. And it's difficult because obviously we require that legally under our structure and framework, and in our culture that's acceptable. In a lot of other cultures that's seen as an accusation and people are really angry and will say, but this person's the principal of our school, we can't possibly ask them to do that because they are a very high standing person, they've got high status, and so I can't go to them and essentially accuse them of this or say they have to prove they are not guilty of this. And so that's always a really difficult one, that negotiation.
Yeah, I think that's dealt with best by policy, right? So first of all, if that was the thing you wanted to do, referring to a policy is much more helpful than saying, no, you have to. No, you have to explain, no, we have a policy that requires this. Now, by the way, I'm not trying to say whether that's a good policy or if it's effective or whatever. All I'm saying is that that's often a good way of being able to broach that kind of particular awkwardness. One of the things, so we talked about quite a lot of qualifications and certifications and proof and evidence. I mean, look, reference checking, with people that they, generally when you provide, go for a job, you've got some kind of CV, you've got some kind of references. Ideally, you want those to be professional, right? Because it's all very well having a family friend, but quite frankly, if they give you 2 of their friends, maybe you need to ask them, hey, you know what, this is probably not going to cut it. I actually need to talk to somebody that knows you professionally.
Because my uncle really likes me, but he's no idea what I do professionally. Do you know what I mean?
And again, a policy can and a policy can help.
How's the teaching?
Well, I mean, you talk about your mother a lot. I mean, while you use it on your blurb, Tom, I think she's quite a credible. I think she's very credible at judging your maths ability.
I mean, it's weird actually because my mother actually is a professor, so it's a bit different. And my father is also
so much better.
My father came to work for me in a summer program at the University of Oxford a few years ago, and I had to write a rationale for the British Council as to why I'd employed my father, and whether he was safe to work with children. It's very difficult because obviously I'm like, well, he's my dad, so I know he's all right, But also they're going, well, he's clearly all right to work on the program because he's a professor and significantly more qualified than I am. But all right, so you have to go through those forms and those policies and write out why he's, why that person is all right. The rationale behind hiring them. You're thinking, well, can't write because he's my dad. And
one of the things that just jumped to me there, Tom, was if you're listening in and you're going, it sounds like quite a lot of work. To be quite frank, an organization, that's what separates you from an individual. That's the service, if I want to, hire Tom for his great English language skills, fine. But I'm really relying that Tom's all right, and I'm probably going to be judging him from word of mouth or some other ways that I can create trust. Maybe also, but that's the difference between an individual and an organization. And actually, that's why an organization can sell it for a higher price and it's where the cost is, you know, like an organization is saying, hey, look, we've had to go through all of these hoops, so you can trust us more on these particular levels.
And I think that's really true in terms of policy with training, because when we're saying to staff, when we're hiring staff and we're bringing staff on board, I always think it's really important to address those issues. And certainly with online teaching, of saying to staff, you are in quite, you know, oh, sorry, apologies. You're in quite a tough spot there, because you are kind of going into that person's home, albeit virtually, and you are building trust and rapport with them, and that can overspill. And people do, you know, quite naturally, quite normally, sometimes find their professor, you know, find their tutor online attractive, and sometimes vice versa, you know. And I think it is really important to address that in training and say, look, these are the boundaries, these are professional, you know, parameters in which that relationship is, and we can't overstep those for very obvious reasons, you know. And that's students of any age, and I think that's important, you know. And it's positions of trust, isn't it? You know, it's very easy also, and I think it's that thing as well. And what I always say to staff is, it's a bit like being in a band. When, you know, if you're in a band, when you're on stage, you're much better looking than when you're not in a band and not on stage. And when you get off stage, sometimes people do think, oh, I fancy this person, but they don't fancy this person. They fancy the person in a band.
Yeah.
And similarly, when you're a tutor, it's easy to appear, you know, witty and interesting, you know, 2 hours a week. Because actually, you know, it's 2 hours a week, isn't it? And people, I think, and teachers sometimes can get seduced, is probably the right word, by people liking them and by their students going, oh, they're great, you know. And I often have that when I'm doing teacher training, where, you know, a tutor will go through the lesson, and then you're talking about it afterwards and saying, well, you know, did they get this? And they're saying, oh, the students love me. You know, well, that's great. That's really nice. If you're in a cafe and you're meeting socially, but as a professional experience, they needed to learn this and they haven't learned this. They've had a lovely time, but they haven't learned this, you know. And so I think addressing that in training is important, isn't it? And I suppose the other big thing for protection is a point you've made a lot, is protection of information.
We're going to get that. That's later on.
Cool. Yeah,
don't you start. It's an acronym.
Jumping in. I'm sorry. Apologies. Internet, I apologise to you. It was my fault entirely. I just went there. So, cool.
Look, let's get on to our third point. And again, this is just helping structurally so we can remember it. Create your own acronyms and include lots of R's so that Tom will be impressed, as a pirate should be. So, no, the next thing we're going to be talking about is the environment. So creating a really safe environment. You do that in an in-person school, and why shouldn't you be able to offer a safe environment? And I'm feeling unsafe about this, Tom. Am I in a teapot? Tom, I think did you just put me in a teapot?
I did, unfortunately, just put you in a teapot. Okay, this was the teapot. Sorry.
No problem. Well, basically what we were saying was, I need to feel safe here, Tom. All right, safe environment. Sure. At least I know that you're safe with some tea. So third thing was the creating a safe environment, right? Yeah. So, and part of that is kind of some of what we talked about before in terms of the behavior in that environment. But the environment itself should be safe, should be reliable, should be, and we can kind of talk about that. Look, I mean, I can talk about LearnCube. I'm going to try and not talk about that, just talk quite generically. But
I think in a sense, LearnCube is an important point, because if you are on a platform where the interaction is controlled, observed, and trackable, traceable, that's huge. That's hugely important. And I think the problems that we've had in terms of safeguarding in the last few months have often been because information was freely bandied about in terms of contact, personal and professional, and also not being through one platform meant that people were kind of very birdlines in terms of that contact anyway, which led to problems for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty important point there, because so, for example, there are ways that you can protect identity, right? So that's one of the most important aspects. We're going to talk about information a little bit later. But the environment can help kind of, obscure some of the information that you maybe don't want to. Just like I'm sure my sister's a primary school teacher. She probably doesn't want everyone to know, you know, they never talk about their first names. You know, always Miss Ash or
Sure.
whatever. And I'm sure that there are other things that kind of apply, and I think probably apply online as well, particularly since Facebook and so many of these other areas can really expose people. So when we're talking about environment though, one of the more, like, I guess, less visible ones is just making sure it's a secure kind of platform. So one of the things that's, we are actually using Zoom for a webinar because it's easy to record, and there are some advantages when you're doing a webinar. But look, it's been in hot water for a lot of things around it. And one of the things that was difficult for it was, and this is really commonplace for people using Zoom, you don't have a unique, it's not like a unique page. You just have a room, and it's just always available, right? Like it's what we call a public room. And so students and any users can kind of just jump right in there. And that's not creating what I would call a safe environment, because you're not saying, hey, this is our space, and we want to protect the virtual environment we're in. Just as in an in-person school, I wouldn't expect strangers from the street to be able to just walk straight in to the room, straight off the street. No, I would expect them to go through some kind of process. And look, in LearnCube, we have that through the platform. And in Zoom, I think or some other kind of platforms, I think they're trying to start using passwords, which I think is a good way forward. But then again, it kind of exposes this, that the main issue is having the same thing that I can always get. The same room is more dangerous than being able to change that link. And I know that there's convenience, there's lack of convenience when you have to kind of change the room, but it makes it a lot more protectable, makes it a lot safer.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one aspect of the environment. Other parts of the environment is control for the teacher in particular. So for example, I don't believe I can turn off your video. I can turn off my own video.
Yeah.
But like turning off video and microphones, they're important. Like if you're going off the off the radar there, Tom, and suddenly you just start, it starts going to Thom Jones and take your hat off, and suddenly the turtleneck comes off. I need to be able to probably, shut this down. I need to be able to remove the student. I might need to, and report that. Like, again, LearnCube, we've got a whole lot of mechanisms that, when you remove, you can kind of leave a reason for that. There's a whole lot of reasons why you might want to remove somebody. Turning off video is not just protecting against like abusive information. It could be very distracting kind of behavior, or even just distracting connections. Somebody's on a bus. It's really distracting. That's not creating a conducive environment for learning. Hey, we might need to mute them or change to a different classroom format if you're in LearnCube, or there's some other reasons. But that's kind of just, I kind of talk a little bit about environment. Again, we could talk a lot more about the environment, but those are some key ideas. It's like protecting who can come into the information, who controls what can be seen and done and interacted on the, for example, even on our whiteboard, we have a lock feature, because we're made for teaching. So you might not want people to be very artistic on a whiteboard if you're a young student. And you've got to have identification, like who wrote the things, like whose annotation is that? Like a lot of platforms you can't even tell, which is a major problem if you've got some creative students that are of the ages between 11 and 15 and they happen to be male.
Or me, because I'm 47, but I will still, given the opportunity on the whiteboard, draw rude pictures. And I'd like to be a better person. I'd like to not do that, but I'm not able to resist that. What can I tell you? I'm sorry, do you know what I mean? But so you do need to have that attributed, because otherwise, it's not pretty.
It's not pretty. So I think we've gone through the environment aspects, and I think there's some really good points out of that. So the next part of what we're talking about is P, protecting. Let me just double check that I've got this right. Process. Yes.
Oh,
process.
Nice. I like that.
So process, I always think of process starting with policy. I think that is, in education, it seems to start with that. Like, what is it that we're okay with? What are we not okay with? What are our goals? And look, you can get over complicated with process, but you need one. Try and simplify it, keep it easy to remember, but there needs to be something. I think you've already alluded to the first part of that process. So we talked about recruitment. I almost see that as part of the process. But then you talked about training. So tell me a little bit about that as part, because that's got to be part of the process. Like, I've recruited.
And I think
next part is
safeguarding is really important in terms of training, because Yeah, and the training thing's key, isn't it? Because it is that thing of saying, as an institution, we work this way, and we won't accept this behaviour.
Yeah.
And that diffuses a lot of discipline things, because if you're saying, I don't want you to do that in my class, then it's a confrontation. Whereas if you're saying you're not allowed to do that in this school, it's much easier, isn't it? And again, you're saying that thing of, you can annotate and say why that person's been excluded or why that person's been asked to talk to you afterwards. And again, talking to somebody afterwards online is significantly easier than that terrible, terrible thing we've all had, the Mexican standoff of saying, don't leave this room because I need to talk to you. But then saying, I need another member of staff here so while I'm talking to you, or I need the door open while I'm talking to you, but I need you to stay in the room and not run off in a huff or not stop out. And it's much easier online, obviously, if you've got to say, right, look, we're opening this up, and you're not embarrassing the student, you're not humiliating the student, and you're sort of respecting their space. And you can also get a colleague to join as well, or you can record it if a colleague's not available.
Right.
And it's, I find a level of sort of, dare I say, egalitarianism, that it's not me looming physically above a student who's sitting down and going, now then, Jenkins, it's very much saying, look, come on, are you all right? Because you weren't like you today, and you're better than that. And, drawing that puerile picture on the whiteboard, not clever. And I sort of feel like the student goes, yeah, no, it wasn't. Why did you do it, sir? And I go, I don't know. But, those conversations are much easier, I find, online. And I find responses of students are often a lot better.
I think you're really right. So I'm going to go, so that's sort of training, so what do we do in certain situations? So really it's like, policy is what are we okay with and not okay. Process is what do we do once one of those things is triggered, particularly if something isn't good. So what happens, if it was this kind of behavior, it's like, you can probably deal with this. Like this kind of situation where it's like, well, this is well outside of my pay grade. It's like, cool, I need to go and talk to who? And you need to have a process for like, okay, I need to talk to this person who's part of my school, just as you would in an in-person school, a physical school. So that's kind of some of the elements that I was working towards.
And again, I think what's lovely about that is that idea that you're reassuring staff with the structure of the process. So look, if this happens, you do this. If this happens, you do this. And if this happens, I'll do it. So you don't have to worry about it. Yeah, and maybe that's part of the process, right? It's usually a living document. Google Docs is fantastic for that. You can even just set up the skeleton. You don't even have to have the full policy written, every single letter. Some of the letters are important, but you don't need to have everything. But even just having a really solid structure of like, hey, these are things that can pop up in an online class. And these are all areas that you probably can deal with, and you can deal with them these ways. If we notice that we're getting a lot of this particular behavior, we're going to have to flesh this one out. If there's anything that's in here that doesn't fit that, like, as I say, like you can leave your hat on kind of moment, then it's like, well, it wasn't on the process doc. All right, I think this needs to elevate to a different level. And then that goes to the next. What I find really interesting is that staff are often very embarrassed, particularly male staff, particularly young male staff, will often be very embarrassed if they get those kind of moments where students are making inappropriate remarks or advances towards them, because they feel like they, that they have somehow invited that, or somehow, or that they shouldn't mind, or they should be able to deal with it because they're lads. And there is a lot of kind of gender stuff which really does infuse their inability to say to you, actually, look, this happened and I felt very uncomfortable. Because, just as we laughed at that thing, and because it's funny, and it was told to me by somebody who was saying this happened and it was funny, but they were also actually saying, and I found it very uncomfortable, and I didn't know what to do. Whereas female staff, I think, are much better, sadly, because they've had a lot more practice of people being inappropriate and unpleasant to them. And lads often are much less able to describe that, or much less able to deal with that, or understand that they should deal with that. So that's interesting.
I think it's really interesting, and I think there'll be a point later on where actually I'll bring it up. One way of maybe dealing with that, I was just thinking, is you kind of go-to line. Like, so for example, on LearnCube, you can record the video if you need to, but we actually recommend, instead of recording everything, which really does add adds a layer of cost. And it's not just LearnCube, it's in any platform. If you're recording and saving to the cloud, there's a level of cost. But there's usually like a free Google, like we've got, for example, a LearnCube Google extension, Chrome extension. We actually use another service called Loom, which is free and really good. But you basically got these tools that are like one press and they start recording, you know, and because we're on a web browser in our particular service, it's very easy to kind of activate, start. And I was just thinking, like, if anyone's that inappropriate, you can be like, great, sorry, do you want me to, I just need to record this for my head teacher. 3, 2, 1. And if they haven't stopped, well, then it's recording. And if they stop, brilliant, you've actually kind of stopped the behavior. Probably you're going to keep that recording on. And you might even say, look, that was really inappropriate what just happened, because it's now recording, right? I feel really uncomfortable, and you've put me in a position that I'm now uncomfortable. I'm gonna, like, let's just assume, depending on how bad this was, you know, let's just assume that you didn't mean to put me in this position, and we'll kind of continue on. I'm going to record every session that we do from now on, and you've put me in this position, but that's just going to have to be how it is. And it's a really good point.
It's a really good point, because I think what a lot of people are saying is, oh, this platform is very good because we can record every session as standard. Whereas I think what's really important is not to do that, because recording every session as standard is universally detested by staff and students. And also, nobody ever watches any of them.
No, they don't.
And you have to store the recordings. Whereas being able to call that in as an emergency service quickly and easily is very powerful. You know, whereas if it's just happening, then it does really change the dynamic of the classroom, and it really makes it difficult for everybody to kind of relax, you know. But I think also the thing that we've talked about before is getting people to join classes at random. So staff will know, and students will know, that other senior members of staff will join and observe and that kind of thing. And I think that's very powerful, because that, you know, you can see that somebody's come into the room, as it were, and you can see that they are there for 3 or 4 minutes, maybe longer, and they participate or they don't participate, depending what your procedure is in the school. But just that they kind of appear and then go away is often enough, I think.
I think it's a differentiator. If you're an organization, if you're an education provider, these are the things that people value, right? Like, that's why you do it. You've got a level, you've got a hierarchy, and you've got somebody that has more experience above the teachers that is also in a position of responsibility that can provide that kind of second check. And I'm sure that applies to, of course, teaching, but it also applies to behavior and to what's okay and what's not okay.
And that's also support, isn't it? In terms of being able to say to members of staff, I really enjoyed that thing I saw you doing on Tuesday, and I thought it was very powerful, and, you know, thanks so much for letting me come in. And people appreciate that, because I think it's very easy to feel, particularly when teaching online, that you are isolated and you are kind of into the ether, and that nobody knows what you're doing in your classroom. And in a physical school, obviously, that's a lot easier on one level, because you're all physically in the same space, and yet you often don't go into a classroom, you often don't make the effort, or you do an observation every term because you have to for your accreditation. Whereas online, it's much easier to flip from room to room and give really useful feedback to teachers and students, you know. So that building experience for students, where you're able, as a principal, as a senior teacher, to contact students and say, oh, Mario, I was in your class the other day and I really enjoyed that stuff you were doing. I thought it was great. Thanks so much for that. Or being able to, when you're doing an all class thing or an all school thing, saying, you know, I was lucky enough to be in the class earlier, and, you know, Carla was doing this thing that was really great, and I was really impressed by it. And Carla, could you just take us through that? You know, and students feel very much that you are engaged in what they're doing and you care. You know, and that's kind of why we're doing this, you know?
Absolutely. I really think it hits the culture of the organization. I mean, again, LearnCube, we're really exposed to a lot of different organizations, schools, online schools, tutoring companies, you know, like kind of very much aware of some different cultures. Certainly in the Western culture, again, I don't have enough experience. I'm a Kiwi, so I can only really talk from my own. But my impression is that teachers really like they want to be treated with respect. They want to be treated and trusted and treated like people that have expertise and professionalism and a mind of their own. They typically don't like being prescribed to and told exactly how they're meant to work minute by minute. They generally don't like the idea of people monitoring them only for bad behavior and never providing positive feedback. Like, for me, this is what I would expect in any organization, regardless of whether they're a teacher or not. And so whatever the culture it is, the tools can either can amplify that either way. So they can amplify it in a positive way. It's like, hey, yeah, my head teacher, if I'm recording this particular segment, he's going to look at it, he's going to provide some feedback, and it's going to be great. Or my head teacher is a complete nightmare. There's no way I want to record anything. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do anything. It's just going to reflect poorly on me. So I'm just going to shut it up and hope that the student never reports it, or I never have to report it. That's the student or nobody else.
But, you know, that comes back to the training thing, doesn't it? Whereas if you said to people, look, if this happens to you, this is what we do and this is how we help you, and it's not your fault.
Yeah.
Because I think that's always really key, isn't it? Is saying to teachers, if students are inappropriate with you, that's not your fault. You haven't initiated that. You haven't created that situation. That has happened to you, and we'll help you deal with that.
That's a really great way of putting it, Tom. And again, I think this is where, like, getting your training, getting your policies, getting your process right, and the way you word it is just so important. And I think, yeah, I really like the wording of that, Tom. Next thing is on protecting information.
I see, yeah.
There we are. So is there, right? So this is, we're getting there. So this is protecting, and this is where the I in PREPIR or PREPIM or whatever you're going to create the acronym of is coming in. But it's information, and particularly personal information. So when you're talking about personal information, some of the most common things are like, what's their name? What's their email, of course, because that's a way of people being able to contact them or message them outside of a secure or safe environment, potentially. Of course, things, like date of birth, what their age, those sorts of things are important. Like, I could go on about what personal information is.
Sure.
Regardless, the point is that there's personal information, and if you're teaching online, you need to protect it. And you need to protect it through the systems that you use. And online, it's probably even more important because so much more data is available, right? Like, the data is processing from you to me through the internet. So if you don't have a good system that's protecting that data, bad people effectively could hijack that stream and kind of learn more about it. So choose a really good technology provider for that particular reason. That's why it's important. Second thing, though, is where is that information? So it's also the user information. And so one of the things that properly makes me quite wary right now is if you don't use a proper system, data is everywhere. Like, you're basically going, hey, sorry, we don't have a proper system, but here's the spreadsheet of every single student name, address, and email.
Yeah.
You can add to it. It's really convenient for you. But it's completely not okay. Because then you're exposing effectively a mailing list or a list of people that want to expect that their information is, it seems crazy to me, because if you think about it, in a physical school, I'm pretty sure a teacher can't just walk up to the reception and go through just the entire list of people, right? They can't just go, oh, sorry, I just wanted to look at all the students, their names, email addresses, and addresses.
Yeah, sure.
Like, no, it's for like people that are privileged and generally have a role for that. So,
I think what's interesting with this is partly the GDPR. The GDPR thing is huge because it's a real onus on companies and people, and yet our entire kind of social culture is all about giving away as much information as possible in social media streams. And yet, what's also interesting, I guess, is the thing where, as a school, we are inviting people to join a community, but also then protecting them within that community. And their information is something that we keep, but we also want to celebrate who they are. And, what's really interesting, I think, with a lot of schools is that thing where they will have a student who is a vlogger or a blogger, for example. And so they will give them and invite them to the school because they want them there, because they have this huge presence and crowd. And yet, then you're saying, but that's a huge amount of information suddenly going out to that, Ukrainian skateboard blogger. Their public of 500,000 people across the world are suddenly getting, live interviews with students, with members of staff, with all that, and you think, oh, hang on, that's all just gone out there and is not coming back. So that protection of information is really, really weird. And, it seems to be kind of an official policy of GDPR, and then a marketing policy or a kind of cultural policy of giving out as much information as possible.
I mean, I think
two complete extremes.
Yeah, I think it is a definite balancing act. One thing I think there is clearly a differentiation between personal information, like information I could not gather just by passing you on the street, right? Like I can pass you on the street and see, yeah, you're wearing a lovely turtleneck and you're kind of into that thing. It's fine. And you're kind of freely giving, of course, the information you're in Wales. That's fine in a way. But what I can't tell is like, where does Thom live? What's his email address, right? I can't tell that by just walking on this or even seeing a video. I can't tell that information. That's why there is and that's why email in particular seems to be the big one. And then I would say almost last name, right? Like Thom, there's a lot of Thoms. I'm not going to be able to find you in the phone book by saying your name's Thom. But that's,
to be honest, Thom Jones, there's a lot of Thom Joneses. I am virtually invisible on the internet, which is brilliant. So, I'm also currently in North Wales, where being called Thom Jones is the equivalent of cultural camouflage, because everybody around me is also a Welsh person called Thom Jones. So, I am virtually invisible here.
I will literally not be able to find you. Oh, he's from Wales. Yeah, hilarious. No, what I was going to say with one of the things that is a little trick that we do tell people that use our online school is instead of using the full teacher name, or sometimes not even the full student name, you may actually prefer to have that information somewhere, sure. But actually in terms of what it's exposed as, is like Thom J, Alex A. And it's not a automated thing all the time, but just a small bit of thought can like actually protect a lot of information from somebody. So I think that's just one.
And I think the other interesting thing as well is the idea that online interaction as opposed to face-to-face interaction. Face-to-face interaction is governed by societal rules that are embedded in us, and online interaction isn't. And online interaction is open to negotiation. Sure. And so a lot of people will do things online that they wouldn't do face-to-face, and they'll often feel that things done online don't count, you know? So that's really dangerous, and it's really frightening, I think, for a lot of people, because there are ways and means you communicate online that you'd never dream of doing face-to-face, you know? No. And that, you know, those things are things that...
Like there's these rules of thumb, right? Like you should behave just as you would in a physical class. Behave just as you would in a physical location. Like, I think that's just an easy rule of thumb. Like, would you do that in person? Well, then don't try that stuff online. But equally, I mean, we want people to be creative around like how they use online virtual environments. But you know, I think when it comes to like, is this behavior okay or not? Would you do it in person or the equivalent? If the answer is no, then probably there's your answer.
And it also circles around to what we said earlier about isolation, because working online in any context, in any capacity, can often feel quite isolating, because if you are with either your family or other people that you interact with daily, that's fine. If you're not, and you interact only online with those people, it can be very easy, you know, if you're busy, well, the only people you see all day are your students, you know, so making sure that you have ways and means to help your staff access or help your staff with loneliness, you know. And it sounds odd, doesn't it? Because if you say to people you're lonely, you're right, people go, no, I'm fine. But actually creating sort of water cooler moments and creating conversations and creating social interaction amongst staff is also really important, you know,
I like that idea. I mean, I think that's got to be somewhere in an acronym somewhere. Maybe that's the extended version, but I think that's a really powerful comment there. Looking after your team is so important. I mean, we really care about our team. I would hate if they were ever put in a situation where they felt endangered or intimidated or threatened. And I'm sure that schools that look after their team members would feel the same. Let's get on to the last one in terms of our kind of list here, which is on, we've talked about protecting people, talked about recruitment, talked about the environment. We have talked about policy and sort of process. We've now talked about information and technology side of things. Now, the last one I really thought of was like reporting or monitoring. That's, I think, a really key part of safeguarding. I was like, no. So the R and kind of what we're talking about here is relating to reporting and monitoring of, we're going to call them users, and I know it sounds a bit generic, but it's because it could be teachers, it could be students, or it could be anyone that's a stakeholder in an online learning experience. Let's start with students though. So in terms of reporting or recording, so we talked already about like if we're safeguarding against behavior, there's a couple of different things. I mean, actually they kind of relate above, you know, like process, right? So if something happens, what happens? You need to record that, and you need to have a process of doing that. Now, that might be how you record that and report that. So for example, in LearnCube, you know, it could be in the summary, it could be, we've got what we call a post-class review. You could kind of write it in the whiteboard or the notes to make it a kind of more kind of official kind of record. For example, we actually, this particular feature, it saves everything that's open at the end of the class, so including the whiteboard, and we are looking at whether the chat should be kind of part of that recorded aspect, because it's a safeguarding piece, right? Like somebody writes gnarly stuff in the chat, or teachers are trying to give out their personal email or something like that. It doesn't look good, you know, and unfortunately systems, you know, maybe even, you know, generic video conferencing software, they don't have that in mind because they've never needed necessarily to protect students in the way that an education platform might need to kind of think about, hey, how do we structurally help or encourage the right behavior? But that's like recording things like chat, what was taught, the video. These are all things that could be recorded potentially or at least reported on. Attendance tracking, like for example, our system automatically records if a student attended or not. Now, one of the things that's powerful about that is that if something happens and the student says, I wasn't even on that, I didn't even know what you're talking about, I wasn't part of that Zoom call. Oh, well, I guess there's no reference for you, you know, like, yeah, but sure. You know, and again, there may be other systems that can do this, but like, it's like, no, like properly, I can see you attended, so actually, I can see you attended this time, you're a bit late. But you know, you kind of want a system that helps safeguard some of those things. But either way, if you don't, then you need to manually do it, right? Like, so make sure that your teachers are recording attendance. Like, that's good for the business, it's good for making sure that everyone knows if the student attended or not. So I think those are some ideas. What about you, Tom? What's the reporting or monitoring aspect there? And because you did touch on it, by the way.
One thing which I find very powerful is often getting staff to swap classes, and that works on a lot of educational academic levels. But I think what I like about the online format is the way that it's very easy to get staff to swap sections of classes. You know, so they can do a bit of each other's classes, or they can do all of each other's classes, occasionally with or without warning, with or without, you know, warning obviously for the staff know that's happening. Students don't need to know that's happening. Sure. So I think it's nice to suddenly swap people in and out, but it also gives you a litmus test of the atmosphere and the dynamic in that classroom. And I think that's quite powerful. And I think getting students to interact with people beyond their teacher on a regular basis, so they are having a welfare chat with a member of staff, which again is so much easier to do online, that you're not trying to collar somebody as they're going in and out of the room. You're not saying, have you got 10 minutes now? Have you got 10 minutes to sit down? You know, you're just able to set up a time and have a meeting. So they are talking to other members of staff, you know, so you are seeing what's happening and getting that idea from them. But also the idea we talked about before in terms of training and onboarding is equally as important for students in terms of saying, look, this behaviour is not acceptable, you know, so that they know from the outset that they've got to, you know, wear clothes, or they've got, you know, and the basics there in terms of interaction online. You know, we've got to set those parameters with them before we expect them to adhere to them. Do you know what I mean? So, us saying to students, this is what we, you know, this is how we behave, and these rules are concrete, and they know what they are, you know, just as we do with staff. Sure. That's important.
No, I think that makes sense. Again, that goes back to process, you know, like how are you kind of finding these moments where you can say, I really like that idea of independent touch points, right? One of our customers is phenomenal at this. They've got like a student coordinator, and it's like their role is really just about making sure that the student feels completely looked after, right? Like the teacher is there to teach, But the student coordinator is like, hey, if you're not happy with this teacher, why don't I help you find a teacher that kind of matches you a little bit more? You know, like, and that's actually really powerful in terms of safeguarding too, because now you've got an independent person that if one person is acting inappropriately, they've got another kind of trusted person and a focal point rather than an info at to be able to kind of talk to about whatever is maybe kind of making them feel uncomfortable. And then the safeguarding again goes back to the tutor, right? Like, do you have some processes where, and we talked about it before, hey, actually, this was an inappropriate situation for the teacher, not for the student. Yeah. And we had a process for recording that. So the teacher recorded it. It was kind of, it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. But don't worry, they had a process and they recorded it. And then 3 months, 5 months later, the student got in trouble with their parents and just lashed out and said their tutor did X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
You know, and then the school's like, wait a minute, I've got a recording, like actually my staff member, the same staff member that you talked about, recorded it, or didn't need to record it. He just wrote me a note and this is what he said. He said, this is the date, this is who it was with, this is what happened, and this is how I felt about what's the, and I actually put the resolution as, this for us didn't seem so out of sort, you know, like that was a misunderstanding, but it didn't seem like something that was a problem that needed to be elevated. And I'm sorry that you're having this particular issue, but I don't think it was really, you know, you can see why I felt that this wasn't requiring us.
Well, you know, that's why that clarity in process is huge, isn't it? In that making sure everybody knows exactly what they need to do, which was, and what is all right and what is not all right.
Yeah.
Right? And making sure that that is black and white, so that there is, you know, very clear parameters, and people know that, you know, because what people do tend to do with any sort of safeguarding, and often with issues of abuse, is trying to kind of downplay them, because they try to kind of go, oh no, it's fine, actually it was all right, actually I didn't mind, and they try and process it in their own minds afterwards, and they automatically try and kind of go, oh no, it was nothing, it's fine actually, and it's really important to be able to bring that out and say, look, it isn't fine, you don't have to sit through that, you don't have to live through that, and if that does happen to you, we want to help you with that. You know?
It sort of does remind me, I'm on a board, I'm like sort of in a governance board in New Zealand, and the organization I work with is phenomenal at health and safety, because it's a big, they actually do like a lot of like litter pickups and those sorts of things. But there's obviously like dangers, potential kind of things that people could pick up that's wrong. Anyway, long story short is health and safety is a core part of their culture. Now, I'm not saying that safeguarding and you know, reporting on near misses is something that you have to do. I'm actually not familiar enough to know if people are already doing that. But what I can tell you is when it's embedded in the culture, and this is about health and safety, so what a lot of people would consider super boring stuff. Most, like 99% of the time, there is nothing to report. Sure. But at the start of our board meetings, we kind of look at it and they go, look, we had a near miss of somebody accidentally, you know, like picking something sharp off the ground. Like it sounds really benign, but when somebody like broke their hand, I think they were like hitting, you know, they were trying to use a spade and they hurt themselves. Anyway, that was reported. And because there's a whole bunch of legislation in New Zealand against, you know, for health and safety, it's an important thing for what we do. I wonder if some similarities could be there in the teaching world, that you, and particularly as the company grows, if this feels like, hey, we want to create a really safe environment for our teachers and for our students, and this is a part of what we do. Maybe that's part of your quarterly meetup, is like go through any kind of reported incidents or near misses or whatever. It doesn't have to be even at the board level. Maybe it's start off at a team level, see if it's impactful. But
I think what's really interesting I think what's hugely interesting with safeguarding is the way that people are terrified of it, and often what they're terrified of is not knowing what they should report or what they should do, what the process is, or what the, and so, you know, exactly as you're saying, that kind of clarity in terms of saying, like, if this happens, do this. If this happens, it is this. You don't have to say, does it feel like this? You know, and knowing that you can pass that up the chain without a judgment. You know, and that people are not going to come on to you and go, hang on, look, this happened and it was your fault, it was on your watch. You know, because we've all had terrible things happen in our classes, and we've all had terrible things happen, you know, to students with us and under our guidance through no fault of our own. You know, it only takes 2 seconds to turn away when somebody, you know, puts another person's head in a drawer. And you know,
that's what happens in the Jones household.
I've been in the classroom, but yeah, actually my kids do that too. But it's funny, isn't it? Because it is exactly that you know, nobody wants those bad things to happen, and people often shy away from safeguarding because they feel like it's somehow inviting terrible things to happen. And actually, what's nice about safeguarding, I find, is that the more you embrace it and make it part of the culture of your school, the more everybody feels happier and more relaxed because they know what the issues are and they know what to do about them. So.
But it comes to that culture, you know, if you set it from the top, this is something we're going to punish you with, expect no support. Teachers will give you no quarter, they will give you no information. Why would they? If you create a culture that's like positive, it's actually like, hey, we're actually doing this for your benefit so I can protect you if there's actually somebody on the other side that's actually trying to cause trouble. So very different, exactly the same process, but could be done in very different words with a very different culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, Tom.
Yeah, pretty well. I'm already wrapped up, as you can see. I'm already a thick turtleneck sweater. But yeah, no, absolutely. And I really enjoyed the conversation as always. And I hope it was useful to the internet watching out there. And if it wasn't, report us.
No, but please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please check out a trial of our virtual classroom at LearnCube.com. And if you want to see the amazing Thom Jones, where are they going to find you, Tom?
They can find me on the interweb at brocksolutionsagency.com.
Wonderful. Excellent. Great. We'll see you again next time.
Thanks ever so much. Cheers.